You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcasts, and I have Dr. Marty Scharf. He's a research director at the Cleveland Sleep Research Clinic. So, Marty, how you doing? Thanks for coming.
I'm doing great, thank you.
Yeah. So I saw in the notes that we're going to be talking about fibromyalgia as a sleep disorder. So maybe you could introduce the concept and where the idea came from, and kind of go from there.
Okay. Fibromyalgia has, to a large extent, been a diagnosis of exclusion with primarily subjective symptoms resulting in the diagnosis. And for many physicians, the absence of objective data and the many different factors that are thought to contribute to fibromyalgia make them just believe that it is not a single entity. In fact, at one point when I submitted a paper on fibromyalgia to the New England Journal of Medicine, I was told by them that they would never accept a paper on fibromyalgia because they didn't believe that it was a real entity. There is no question in my mind that it is very real. And the most common symptom in the disorder is a complaint of non-restorative sleep. Patients tell you that no matter how much they still wake up tired. They wake up in a fog. And the most prominent symptom is pain. And they have pain upon palpation at as many as 18 different tender points. And when they get a flare-up, it is extremely uncomfortable. So let me give you a little background on this condition. And the way I got to it. Okay, as a sleep clinician, I was interested in treating a lot of different sleep disorders, including narcolepsy. And a paper out of Canada by Mamelak and Broughton reported that gamma-hydroxybutyrate, a precursor and metabolite of GABA, the most common, one of the most common neurotransmitters in our body, that these folks have some real problems with the binding of GABA. That's what we think. What happens is they present with all of these symptoms. The diagnostic criteria are a history of those different pain areas, no other factors contributing to it, and if they have the constellation, they're given the diagnosis. There's really nothing that's very effective to treat the condition except a couple compounds that have been approved that primarily work on pain and don't really help the majority of the other symptoms. So I was working on treating narcolepsy and introduced to the drug gamma-hydroxybutyrate, which had a dramatic effect on these patients. I was given permission by the FDA to conduct an open-label study on these folks, which lasted for 17 years. We collected 800 patient years of safety data, more safety data than any orphan drug in history. I was contacted eventually by the FDA, the Division of Orphan Drug Products, and introduced to a company called Orphan Medical. I offered Orphan Medical all of our data for free if they would develop the drug. They went ahead and did it, and their findings were virtually identical to our own that we had already published. Well, in 2002, ultimately, the drug was approved for the treatment of narcolepsy. Unfortunately, along the way, the GHB was used for date rape and for other illicit uses, and became reclassified. It was an over-the-counter compound, and it became reclassified as a class 1 compound with no medicinal value whatsoever. Well, but after testifying at the in Congress to the Judiciary Committee, I was able to get the drug a bifurcated approval. So it was approved for use in narcolepsy only, and any other use was considered completely illicit. Okay, well, now the drug was approved, and we began to consider what else is going on here. The drug, we found, increased the deep stages of sleep in a dose-response way. So in order to test if this was real, we knew that 80% of one's growth hormone is released during the deep stages of sleep. So to see if this was pharmacologic, physiologic rather, we began to test the drug first with Dr. Evan Powder at the University of Chicago to see if it had a dose-response effect on growth hormone, and indeed it did. So now we have a compound that increases the deep stages of sleep in a dose-response way, and similarly increases the release of growth hormone in a dose-response way. So we began to look for a disorder where there was a deficiency in growth hormone, and that's where we discovered the literature on fibromyalgia, and the fact that, again, these fibromyalgia patients their sleep issues are just horrific. It's, if you don't sleep, or if your sleep is not restful, it's like torture. So we did a study in patients with fibromyalgia. Now, here's something that's very critical to the remainder of the discussion, and that is that Moldavsky in Canada had a series of papers in which he reported that 70%, 2/3 of patients with fibromyalgia have an abnormality in their sleep called alpha intrusion. Alpha waves, which we're all familiar with, are brainwave patterns of 8 to 12 cycles per second or around there, and occur primarily during relaxed wakefulness. Okay, and while they may be present somewhat in sleep, they generally the alpha waves generally disappear during sleep, and but for some people, the alpha waves persist during sleep, and in fact are superimposed on the other wave patterns throughout the night. Well, this was first described in people with depression, that people had this alpha wave intrusion, and now we're seeing it in fibromyalgia. Okay, but it's only 70%. So I did a study looking at what we did is we took patients with a history of fibromyalgia. Now, again, this is all subjective, okay? And we ran them in the sleep lab, and we identified the patients that had at least 30% of their non-REM epochs with alpha waves. Now, that's an arbitrary cutoff, but having been in the sleep field for so long, we knew that was abnormal. So we would just accept.
Can you say more about that? What does that mean? Non-REM epochs and can you be a little bit more specific?
Okay. When we look at sleep, we're looking at sleep in 30-second segments. And the reason we were looking at it in 30-second segments is because at that time we were still collecting data on paper through an EEG machine, and each page would last 30 seconds, so that a box of paper, which was 1,000 pages, would last for 8 hours. Okay, that's the way it had been recorded previously before the computer age. So we would go through the pages, and if the person had at least 30% of non-REM sleep, and remember, sleep is divided into REM sleep, where dreaming occurs, and non-REM sleep, which is where stages 1, 2, and 3 are present. Okay, so we looked at the non-REM sleep and we looked for the alpha intrusion in at least 30% of the epoch. When we did that, we now had a more homogeneous population. Remember that the people with fibromyalgia are thought to have a variety of etiology, and in some cases there were people that were reporting after some type of an auto accident where they had were really bumped around, would develop symptoms of fibromyalgia afterwards. And of course, they'd go after the accident, they were fine. A little while later, they're going to the doctor, telling them about all these aches and pains, and nobody's believing them, and they're just thinking lawsuit. Okay, so we were trying to find some objective information about this, and the sleep EEG gave us that objective information that we could use to try to make the group more homogeneous. Well, we did that. And then we started our study in gamma hydroxybutyrate, GHB, which is marketed as Xyrem by Jazz Pharmaceuticals for the treatment of narcolepsy. Well, our result, we used the same type of design in terms of how we administered the drug, which was twice a night because the drug has a very short half-life. And lo and behold, the results of our study, showed a significant increase in slow wave sleep that was maintained. But what we saw was, for the very first time, a decrease in the alpha wave component. We were literally fixing their sleep. And along with that was a dramatic improvement in pain. In fact, one of the first things that the patients told us was that they experienced a clarity in thinking. The fibro fog was gone. The pain was markedly reduced. Their sleep was dramatically improved. And they would wake up and go, so this is what it's like to feel refreshed. We were thrilled. And to us, having seen this and now beginning to understand that this may be, even in cases where you see alpha intrusion in depression, no one has really paid any attention to that. No one has paid any attention to the effects of antidepressants on sleep patterns. They're not even tested on sleep patterns. So we have no idea about that direction.
What is alpha intrusion, by the way? Can you define that more, and what happens specifically?
Yes, it was first called alpha delta sleep, where the delta waves, which are the high voltage slow waves of deep sleep, when you see somebody having a lot of delta sleep, that's where night sweats occur. Usually occurs in the first part of the night. Good deep sleep is wasted on children that don't appreciate it, but they have it with every single cycle. And as we get older, we begin to lose some of that deep sleep along with losing our growth hormone. When alpha waves are present, superimposed on the deep slow waves, that's called alpha delta sleep. And they look like delta waves with sort of a sawtooth side to their to the rise and fall of the wave. It's very obvious to anybody who's looked at these that this is not your typical slow wave. And we call it alpha. That was called alpha delta sleep. We've seen alpha intrusion throughout the whole night in most of these patients. Okay, so
what causes it? What causes it? What is the effect of the alpha intrusion?
We don't know what causes the non-restorative sleep, and we don't know what causes fibromyalgia. There is a theory out there now that fibromyalgia may be a result of the herpes virus. Patients with fibromyalgia almost never get cold sores. Okay, and the herpes virus attacks the nervous system, which it loves. Okay, and for some people, the results are a cold sore. For other people, it lingers and it is contributing to the fibromyalgia. Now, my understanding is that some people are working on and have gotten approved a vaccine for this condition. How that all is going to work out, I don't know yet. Okay, but I do know that compared to the drugs currently approved for fibromyalgia, we were able to show a a very dramatic effect. But again, just to show you how important this is, there have been several studies of pregabalin or Lyrica. Okay, Daiichi had come out with a more effective long-term Lyrica, and it was tested in fibromyalgia worldwide all at once. They were so sure of the success of this that rather than do it in one country at a time, they did it worldwide, expecting to be able to launch it worldwide all at once. Well, I was part of that. In the investigator meeting, I stood up and asked, how can you do a study in fibromyalgia without a sleep component? Okay, and they basically said, well, we didn't use a sleep component. Other people didn't use it, so we didn't use it. It wasn't considered necessary. And I said, but you don't have a homogeneous population. And here's what happened. Okay, they didn't reach significance, even though Lyrica itself is marketed because it reached significance. This compound did not. And what I believe happened, and this happened with Tonic's drug for fibromyalgia. It happened with Astellas' drug with fibromyalgia. What they did was they did it the old-fashioned way, selecting people on the basis of history. Well, if a third of your people really don't have the condition that you think you're treating or you're testing, it's going to affect it's going to dilute the effectiveness and impact your ability to reach the.
Okay, so I was asking you. So did they naysay the sleep component, or did they say, "Oh, okay, we'll include it"? What happened?
No, they just dropped it. Okay, they never did anything more with it. Okay, so all that money's been wasted, and I'm absolutely convinced that had they, because if a third of your patients don't meet the criteria, they're going to dilute the findings, and you're going to end up a greater likelihood of having a negative finding, which is exactly what happened with each of these companies, okay, and each of these compounds. Now, we know that the GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate, binds to the GABA B receptor. There are GABA A and GABA B receptors. GABA A is where benzodiazepines bind. GABA B is where GHB binds, and it also binds to its own specific receptor. GHB has we began to look at what's called positive allosteric modulators, which essentially enhance the binding characteristics of compounds at the GHB, the GABA B receptor. Okay. Now, those compounds like baclofen, which is very similar to GHB, should do the same thing as GHB. In fact, it does, but it has a lot of withdrawal effects, and it has a lot of side effects, which really makes it not very useful. So what we are currently doing is looking at these positive allosteric modulators and trying to convince a company to just do a study in patients who have the alpha intrusion. I don't know what the other 30% are, okay? But I know that these people all seem to react the same. And I have to tell you, I want to tell you how effective this was. When the FDA held its hearings on the approval of GHB for fibromyalgia, there were two meetings. One was a public meeting, and the other was a private meeting with professionals and consultants. At the public meeting, people spoke up, and they were in tears. It was a very loud meeting. They were saying they would rather suicide than go back to the way they were. A lot of the sleep community had embraced our findings and were using this and treating patients with GHB based on their EEG findings. But when they got into the hearing, the closed hearing, the FDA and the advisor's position was, this is a dangerous drug. It may be safe giving it to people with narcolepsy because you don't have that many people with narcolepsy. But there are up to 6 million people with fibromyalgia. And is that going to be safe? Well, we looked through the diversion, the illicit diversion. We did all kinds of things. I'm convinced that they could have come up with a system to assure the safety of the compound, but they turned it down, despite the fact that, despite the fact that our data showed that it was more effective than anything else that was out there. But their focus was on the primary outcomes, which was pain. And that's what everybody was focusing on. And here we were looking at the spectrum of findings and finding that, there's much more to it. And this drug is really getting to what we think is the heart of it. And seeing the change in the alpha intrusion was remarkable. I mean,
quick question with the alpha intrusion, would that show up on a sleep study, or how would you find out if you think you have fibromyalgia, you have a sleep study, right?
That's exactly how. So, my thinking was, we can get the rheumatologist to do this in seeing these patients, and it would help with a diagnosis, and it would help justify the treatment and the use of the compound. But there was so much controversy around quote unquote date rape. Let me tell you. Give me an example. In Houston, there is a congresswoman by the name of Sheila Jackson Lee. Okay, and when I testified before the House Judiciary Committee, Sheila Jackson Lee had brought forth a regulation to completely ban GHB because someone in her district apparently died of an overdose of GHB. And that was based on the autopsy studies. Well, guess what? Okay. GHB has been found to protect against hypoxia, and your body generates GHB when it's dying. So as you're dying, the GHB levels rise as your body is attempting to protect
so they mistook that.
And they didn't know that was occurring, okay? So the drug got this really bad rap. And, I mean, there's no question that if you mix GHB and alcohol, you have a synergistic effect. 1 and 1 is 3. But that's true if you mix alcohol with a number of drugs. Just ask Bill Cosby, okay? So to pick this particular compound out when, that this was mixed up with benzodiazepines. Anytime there was date rape, GHB would always be mentioned, and it's like, quote unquote, the date rape drug. Well, that's just not true. Because they were finding GHB at death. Well, now we know why. This is an endogenous substance. We have it in our bodies. Okay? What's it there for? I can't tell you. But I can tell you that given the major complaint related to sleep, given the objective finding of a sleep pattern that is associated with complaints of non-restorative sleep, given the correction of that, and given the fact that 70% of the patients with fibro have this same abnormality, to me, screening for in people with a history suggestive of fibromyalgia makes a lot of sense. This should be part of a sleep laboratory study. Unfortunately, sleep medicine has sort of gone off in a different direction, where when people think about sleep medicine, the only thing they think about is sleep apnea. And you can diagnose sleep apnea without an EEG, without brainwaves. You don't need brainwaves to know that somebody stopped breathing. But here it's a disorder where you need the sleep EEG. You need an EEG to make this diagnosis. And we're hoping that this leads to other disorders that have abnormalities associated with them in the brainwaves that will be formally tested in as part of sleep medicine. So I'm convinced.
Do you think other disorders may have the same alpha intrusion?
Well,
do you think it occurs in other spots?
The initial finding, look, they're using GHB right now in Europe for treating alcoholism, for treating opiate withdrawal, for treating in surgery, especially in brain surgery, because it protects against hypoxia. Animal studies showing that where the rats or rabbits were pre-treated with GHB before having their coronary arteries tied off, or their so that they would infarct. The animals pre-treated went 10 minutes without infarct, which is amazing. I mean, this compound protected against hypoxia. And finally, looking at depression. Now, in treating depression, it's sort of like one size fits all. Okay, you've got a patient with a history of depression. You try him on an antidepressant. You give it 6 weeks. If it doesn't work, you switch the dose. If it doesn't work, you switch to something else, a different class. You're going to lose a lot of people in the treatment while you're trying. And some people never really respond. And it does take a long time. And I believe that, rather than only using subjective data, the objective data is really critical. And that we may find much better means of treating things like depression if we use the sleep EEG in the evaluation. Granted, it adds some expense, but it makes a lot of sense. And given the numbers of people who have depression, I think that this is a very reasonable thing to do, is to go look and see what the different drugs are doing to it. But going back to fibromyalgia, given the misery, this is a condition that generally doesn't go away. Given the misery that people experience, it amazes me that I guess companies have tried very hard, spent a real lot of money, and failed. But they failed because when you do what everyone else does, you get what everyone else has.
Right, makes sense. Yeah.
When you do the tests that they do on these drugs, you're going to get something similar to what they all have. And what I'm suggesting is, let's look at these other things that are abnormal, especially in the majority of the patients, their sleep patterns. And we've demonstrated that we can fix it. Then why aren't we either going to go with the route that we've gone, or find another compound in that class, which I believe that there are positive allosteric modulators that do not cause, that don't have to be given twice a night, that don't aren't going to have dependence liability, aren't going to have they're not going to be used as date rape type of compounds, and can be very, very more specific. I think the finding of alpha intrusion and our persistence in seeing it and ability to correct it is just something that's very, very important. Number one, it could be very important for the sleep field. Number two, it can be very, very important for rheumatologists. Number three, it could provide an answer to general physicians in terms of what to do with these patients. I have to tell you, you go around and ask physicians, what's the worst kind of patient that you have to see? And they'll tell you fibromyalgia patients, okay? They drive you crazy because there's nothing that works. And if you were in
pain, it seems like a lot of doctors naysay and say, "Oh, you're fine. It's just in your imagination." And I guess because they can't figure out where it's coming from, how to treat it, any of that.
Okay. How insulting. The very, very vast majority of patients with fibromyalgia are women. Okay. I am very skeptical when I see a man diagnosed with fibromyalgia. The majority of these patients are women. They go into the doctor, and the doctor says, it's all in your head. How insulting, okay? And they leave being told to go see a psychiatrist. The stories that I have heard, I'm telling you, ask the rheumatologist. They will tell you, they will confirm. This is the worst type of patient that we have to see. We don't want to see these people. They're a pain in the butt. Nothing works. They're constantly complaining. They say they don't sleep. Their mood is affected. They say they hurt. Can't find anything. That although they do show evidence, biochemical evidence of pain, but and nothing has worked. And again, my belief is that nothing has worked because you've diluted your population with so many other complaints leading to a similar complaint of pain, so many other symptoms, that you're never going to get anything effective unless you get more objective data. So that's where I'm at. I mean, my contribution in the sleep field has been primarily, other than working on virtually every sleep and wake medication that's been approved in the United States in the last 40 years. We managed to get...
Quick question about the GHB. Why do you think it has a positive effect on sleep? What do you think is the mechanism?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, we don't even know why it's there, except that years ago I was a consultant. I was the sleep consultant to the infant apnea team at Children's Hospital. And my job was to assess children, some who have been reported to stop breathing frequently at home, others who had near-death experiences, others who died. And, I began to ask myself, what the heck's going on here? You never see SIDS in the first month of life, never. Okay. And generally after the fourth month, it's already rare, but it's like hardly ever seen. What's the difference? They have no blood-brain barrier. The GHB is circulating. GHB protects against the hypoxia, the apnea of infancy that we see in every newborn, and that it's possible that there's some abnormality either with their GHB or with the receptors involved that because when the autopsies occur in these infants, they find petechiae in the lungs, bleeds, and that the final event was not the only event. So they're missing something, and that there's something in there that's protecting some kids and not others. And we believe that what's it there for? The endogenous GHB may really be helping these kids through that period. So we see some other potential uses for it. It's just that everybody is afraid of it. I mean, this isn't OxyContin, okay? We're not creating a group of addicts. People that I put on this drug and followed for at least 17 years, they did wonderfully throughout. They didn't require an increase in the dose. They didn't go through withdrawal. It changed their lives. And we believe that just as we did that with narcolepsy, that we can do that with this condition. In the people that I treated for fibro with GHB, when we were able to use it, it was one of the most blessed things that I could ever imagine having the ability to accomplish, to give these people something that they haven't had for such a long time. It was so humbling, but at the same time creating so much pride, and then to see it just disappear because the experts were saying, well, you have to give it twice a night. What if a kid comes by and takes it off your table? Well, wait a minute. Put it on a higher table, okay? Well, what if a kid comes by, and it's like, come on now, okay? I mean...
Well, they could always make a prescription. I mean, oxycodone's prescription, and what if a kid takes that? It's far worse than GHB. So all the excuses are just BS, sounds like. Yeah.
There's a lot of politics involved in all of this. And what happened is that when I got started, we had to worry about the FDA. By the time I got finished, we had both the FDA and the DEA. And the DEA was absolutely opposed to this. And just again, for political reasons. So we had to fight everybody, and we still managed to win the day when it came to narcolepsy, but we couldn't win the day when it came to fibro. And I understand that. I mean, giving it to 6 million people a drug that has, abuse potential. But again, I'm very, very hopeful that within this next year, we will be able to identify a positive allosteric modulator of the GABA B receptor that has a positive effect in this condition, and I'm convinced that we'll get there. So
okay.
That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yep. So, all right. Well, we're pretty much out of time. So, what's the best way for folks to get in touch and to ask questions and find out more?
513-314-3693. But they must leave a message.
Any email that would be good if you're open to that?
SleepSat1, SLEEP SAT, the number 1 at AOL.com. I'm open to that.
Okay.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.